On the 20th of March, our titled Socratic stage is Borders, National Sovereignty, and Rule of Law. Borders are Tom Homan will be there to present, as well as Chad Wolf, the former acting Homeland Security Secretary. And then on the 12th of April, comedian and actor Russell Brand will join us for, I'm sure, will be a delightfully entertaining and comedic event. So we hope to welcome you to all of those events. Also like to recognize Michael and Lane Markovitz, our Socratic stage sponsors, and our dear friends, supporters of New College, and thank them for their continued support. Tonight we have a wonderful evening ahead for you. I'm not going to spoil the accolades of our speaker, but I do get the pleasure of introducing one of our outstanding faculty members. Professor David Edwards comes to us from Florida State University, where he earned his PhD. He is a teacher here of religious studies and Judaism. He holds a Master of Divinity from the Southeastern Seminar and a BA in History. Dr. Edwards is new to New College this year. He's been an outstanding addition to our already wonderful faculty. Please welcome Dr. Edwards. David?
Introducing our guest speaker tonight, Professor Jacob L. Wright. I'm really excited about the talk he's going to give us. I think it's going to be intriguing, thought-provoking, deeply interesting and relevant. Professor Wright comes to us from Candler School of Theology at Emory University, where he's been since 2007, where he is the only Jewish faculty member, in fact. And he's professor of Hebrew Bible, currently the chair of Biblical Studies, and associate faculty at Emory's Center for Law and Religion. He earned a bachelor's from University of Missouri, Kansas City, and a doctorate from the University of Göttingen in Germany. He is the recipient of several awards and grants that are worth mentioning. 2011 and 12, a National Endowment for the Humanities Fellowship, and in 2015, a grant from the Templeton Foundation. I'd like to say, especially, he's been an innovator in digital humanities. This is not an area that people in our field typically dabble in all that much. He published an enhanced ebook with Apple's iTunes titled King David and His Reign Revisited, and he launched a massive open online course with Coursera that if you're interested you can still take, and tens of thousands have enrolled in. It's called The Bible's Prehistory, Purpose, and Political Future. He's published lots of articles and essays and chapters, but I'll mention some of his books. His first book, Rebuilding Identity, the Nehemiah Memoir and Its Earliest Readers, in 2004, which won a Templeton Prize for first book in religion. In 2014, a book titled David, King of Israel, and Caleb and Biblical Memory, which won an award from the American Schools of Oriental Research. Most recently, and I think the book that is most directly related to tonight's talk, Why the Bible Began, an Alternative History of Scripture and Its Origins, also won awards and made it on several bestseller lists, best books lists, New Yorker, Publishers Weekly. I would highly recommend that book if you find tonight's talk interesting. I think you would really enjoy it. So without any delay, please join me in welcoming Dr. Wright to the stage.
Hello? Okay. Okay. Yes, I'm wearing cowboy boots. My name is Jacob Wright, as you've heard, and I've come all the way from Atlanta, Georgia, an hour and a half on a flight. It's much colder there today than it is in Sarasota, and so I'm very pleased to be here. The one who actually brought me here is Rabbi Altshuler and his wife, Elichka, and I'm going to do a scholar in residence, which is kind of a thing that Jews do. In contrast to churches, we spread it out over 3 days, and it's kind of a time of learning, and so I'm really looking forward to that. But Dr. Edwards was reaching out to Rabbi Altshuler. He wanted to bring his students to see a synagogue, and they connected, and Stuart told David about this, and so it's really wonderful that I got to come here. I'm so pleased to be among a lineup with Judith Butler and Russell Brand and so forth, I never thought I would see myself in a book like that. But so what we want to do tonight is think about the place that the Bible has within public life. Now, my fundamental contention tonight is that it doesn't get the kind of attention it needs. So there's big debates about the Ten Commandments being displayed in front of courthouses and what the Bible teaches in relation to morality and ethics and this and that. But in focusing on what the Bible teaches, we lose sight of how the Bible goes about negotiating belonging. What the Bible does, according to this book that I've just published, is it asks the question for the first time in human history, what does it mean to be a people? So there were long-time kingdoms and empires and city-states and tribes and so forth, and everyone understood what a tribe is and what a city-state is. But what is a people? We take that for granted. We the people. But we owe this peoplehood concept to a group of scribes, unnamed folks, who were writing in the darkest of days after they had lost everything. Their societies were devastated. And they sat together across space, trading their works, sending them from Babylon to Jerusalem and across generations as well, removing themselves from the picture completely and putting together one of the most impressive works of literature, corpora of literature, the history has ever known. We're talking about the great books series that we want to bring to our colleges, and I really appreciate what you're doing here. But you're talking about great books. What is greater than the Hebrew Bible? And it's not because it's revelation, and you don't have to believe in God even to appreciate it. This is a work of literature that begins with creation, with the most beautiful words ever spoken. Yehi or, let there be light. And a God that creates not through the sword, slaying Tiamat as the Babylonian epics have it, right? Creating out of this carcass new heavens and new earths. And the Babylonian empire is supposed to go out and do the same to the universe, to the globe out there. No, this is a God who creates with God's words. A God who has a vision, works for 6 days, takes pleasure in this work, sits back and rests, and looks at it and says, that is good. That's good. That is a radically new vision, and it begins already in the first pages, and it goes on and on to tell the story of how a people came to being, not through just men like Abraham. Abraham, remember, he thinks when he's told by God to go and become the father of a great nation, oh, it's all about me. And it takes him time after time to learn, it's not about you. If I'm telling you, you are going to be the father of a great nation, it might have something to do with your wife right there, Sarah. She's going to play a big role too. And it takes him so long. We get it pretty early on. He doesn't. But on through all of the liberation from Egypt, the moving through the wilderness, coming together at the Mount Sinai, covenanting with their God, writing laws down for the first time in human history, where all members of society are going to be bound by a common written body of laws. And these laws are implanted in their story of liberation. Yes, it's with God, but there's God, and that everybody is equal under this God. And on how the people conquer the land, but also how they lose it, right? That's how the story goes on. This is not a story of a phoenix rising from the ashes. Atlanta is the story, the motto of Atlanta is resurgens. After the Civil War, Atlanta is like a phoenix, rises from the ashes and rebuilds. The biblical authors, that's a common script. Most people tell their story about, we began here, but we are now here. You know what the biblical authors did? They flipped that script. They said, at the beginning, we had liberation. At the beginning, we had a great moment at the sea. But you know how the story ends? The one that begins in Genesis with the beautiful, let there be light. It ends, and a lot of people don't know this because of the Christian Bibles kind of add a few other things to it. But in the older canon, it ends with this: the destruction of Jerusalem, the exile. Everything is gone. And that's how this massive saga that begins with creation, and then the making of a nation through men and women, and then liberation, and then it goes, and then King David taking down Goliath, but then down, 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 till nothing is left. And that's how the story ends. That gives me goosebumps. Why? Because it poses the question of what now? If you had begun the story with, we were really oppressed and now we've been liberated, what now? We go on living liberated lives. But if we began with liberation and now we've lost that, well, how are we going to get it back? Under what conditions? Will it be the same? And that then refocuses the question on this: what does it even mean to be a people? Right? What does it mean to be a people without a kingdom? The Jewish people today are facing some of the most major hurdles that they've faced since the Holocaust. We are all very, very worried about the future. But the biblical authors were facing much greater obstacles. This was a kingdom that had existed for centuries. They had their sovereignty. They had their land. They had their great kings. They had their moments of defeat. Yeah, like all kingdoms do. But when they really start writing, it's when everything is gone. And in the moments of the darkest despair, of devastation, of exile, of disease and everything, they're sitting down in their chambers and they're writing great stories. They're writing great prophecies and poetry, like 2nd Isaiah, Nachamu, Nachamu, which is comfort ye my people, which the Handel's Messiah begins with. Can you imagine? Handel wrote that symphony, or what is it? Handel's Messiah, is it a symphony? I don't know. But he wrote that in the service of a great king of England. Forget which name, sorry, I'll have to get back to you on that. But that's Handel. The original writers were writing all those words in the most dismal of conditions. And they dug deep and they became poetic, but they also had a great vision. They had a vision that things would be better someday. How could they think that things would be better someday? Throughout the ancient Near East and into Greece, the common view is the world goes like this. History is like this. Things go up and things go down. Things go up and things go down. I like the story that is in a Confucian story about a guy who has a son. He's a Chinese guy in a Chinese village. This goes way back. And all the villagers say, "Oh my God, you have such a beautiful son. You must be so proud. You're so fortunate." The next week, the son breaks his foot, breaks his leg. "Oh my God, you must be so upset. Your son has a broken foot. It's never going to be the same." The next week, the king comes through and recruits all the men who can fight, all the boys. And the son gets left because he can't fight. And on. So that vision is, we don't know where we are. It can go up and go down. Think about the Greeks. Pandora's box. Pandora means the bearer of all gifts. She's the first woman who's created. And when she's created, she unleashes on mankind, literally men, all kinds, her box, it's really more of a vessel, all kinds of the evils that we see today in our world. But that box is shut at the very last moment. And you know what the one thing that is shut and not released? Does anybody know? Hope. Hope is the one evil that is contained in her jar or her box. And the Greeks would think, and on into Nietzsche, the guy who said God is dead in the 19th century, that hope is the worst of all evils. Nietzsche, Friedrich Nietzsche from Germany, who would later go on and really influence a lot of fascist thought and so forth, said hope was an invention of the Jewish people, underdogs, who tried to flip the script and say being powerful is not about having might, it's about something else. But Nietzsche said, no, we know that not to be true. And Christians came along and adopted that narrative of the powerlessness, of that there's hope within powerlessness. And what Nietzsche wanted to do was revive this Übermensch, this Superman kind of attitude. And Germans would then go back to that kind of primordial pagan, what he would call roots, that would then shun hope and just seize the moment. But Nietzsche hit on something very important, and that is hope is a Jewish invention. Children are naturally born with hope. There's the story of a girl from Dachau. I went to Dachau right after college, by the way, to the concentration camp. And we worked there as students with students from all over Europe. It was not long after the fall of the Berlin Wall. It was around 2000. And so I had a personal experience there, but so I've always been interested in the Dachau stories. But there was a girl in Dachau who was suffering from a disease, and everyone thought she was going to die. But she held on, she held on, she held on for months and months until years. And then came a time she said, I know that everybody said the camp is going to be liberated by Easter. The camp wasn't liberated by Easter. And she gave up, and she died. Hope, though, in her didn't need to be taught. There are the stories of, do you guys know these bald eagles living out on outside LA, where these eagles are building nests and trying to hatch eggs and so forth, and the eggs don't hatch in the storms, but they never give up. They have hope. So children and animals and so forth naturally have hope. But our culture, why don't adults have hope? Because our culture teaches us to unlearn that hope. All kinds of forces around us try to say there really is no hope. It's all about the most powerful. It's all about different things beyond our control. And that's where we have to look to cultural forces to relearn hope. The hope that we might have had as children, we unlearn that as we grow to an adulthood. But that's where the biblical scribes came into being. They found hope in the darkest of times. They found hope in writing their story, but they also found hope in thinking about their own responsibility. Now, if you were to go to a therapist today and you had suffered something and the therapist said, well, what did you do to actually bring this on yourself? That would be a bit difficult, right? Sometimes we do bring it upon ourselves when something bad happens, but often we want sympathy. But what the biblical authors did is really pose that question for their communities as they created hope. What have we done to bring upon ourselves this misery? The book of Job says, well, we can't apply that to the individual, right? The book of Job is this guy who loses everything, and all his friends say, oh, you must have done something to merit this. And Job says, no, I haven't done anything. And he fights with God. And it's a powerful story. So on the individual level, it doesn't really work. But on the collective level, when things go awry, that's where the biblical authors really did their most creative work. And they said, what have we done to bring our own downfall upon us? And so they go back in their history and they lay out different stages of where things were good and where things went awry. And as they do that, they really unpack truths that we take for granted today. And the most fundamental of them is that it's possible to be a people without a state. So what is a people? We would say a people is something that is beyond statehood. So we say the people of America. America is a nation state. What is a nation?
A nation is not a country. So Canada is not a nation. We might think of that in those terms, but it's really a state. We have nation states, such as Germany and France and so forth. So what is the nation? It's the people that inhabit that state. A nation state is different from a kingdom. A kingdom doesn't have a nation governing it, it has a king, right? So what is a nation? It's the people who inhabit a state. It's the American people, or the British people, or the French people. But that took a long time in history to pose that question. A French people? An American people? Those things were not taken for granted at all until they would go back and look at how the biblical authors thought about peoplehood. It was the American founders who would go directly to the Hebrew Bible and say, here is a model of peoplehood. And we have to learn from this in order that we, the people, can then form a more perfect union, a state, and so forth. But the people have primacy, not the state. The state can come and the state can go, right? The people become a people through the work of the women in Genesis, through the liberation of their God in Exodus, and through their covenanting and their laws and so forth. There are people there. There is no David yet. There's no Goliath that is defeated. There's no throne and kingdom and soldiers and so forth. That comes way back in the narrative. You have to read book after book after book until you get to David. So there's a people or a nation before there's a state in the form of a kingdom. Does this make sense to everybody? Should I reiterate this a little bit? So you have a separation between nation and state. That separation is invented by the biblical authors. That there can be a people without a state. And in order to have a good state, you have to understand that the people are more important than the state. The state's function is to protect, to provide security, to make sure that the people have what they need to survive. But the state is not the summum bonum, the thing that everyone should be reaching for. That is, we may take that for granted at some level, but it's not been that way in most philosophical thought. For example, the great German thinker Hegel thought that the state, the German state, that is the highest of all human evolution. It's the state. It's the institutions of government and so forth. The biblical authors would have strongly disagreed. David, yes, had a purpose to serve, but the history of our people does not begin with David. David comes way late. What is most important is what the people do in terms of laying out their laws, their covenant with their God, and all of the different institutions that are going to preserve them once everything that David had achieved is no longer available. So that's why the narrative ends with defeat. It begins with creation, it begins really well, and it ends really poorly, because it wants to bring back to their audience, the readers, what now? Who are we? The kingdom is now gone. But if you look back in the narrative, there was something long before a kingdom. And it goes book after book after book after book. And that's what we study together. As Jews in the synagogue, we have the 5 books, the Pentateuch, the 5 books of the Torah. That's where we spend most of our time. There is nothing about a king in those 5 books, only one passage. Everything about kingship and the kingdom and the state and the standing borders and all the standing army and all of that, that's something that will come later in time, but it has to be central for the readers to understand that's not essential for our existence. Why do I bring that all to the fore right now? Because as we are engaging each other around all kinds of issues in society, we have deep divisions, and the Bible is one of the points of contention. What place should we give Bible in public life and so forth? The thing that's missed out most in all of these discussions is how the biblical authors created the very fundamental concept of what we need in order to survive. And that is, they implanted a sense of kinship, of love for neighbor, an ability to see across boundaries and differences, and to say we are still one people. And by studying the formation of this text and studying how it works, one can also begin to understand what it takes to love one's neighbor. That's the most fundamental issue facing us today. There is such an inability to really embrace love for neighbor, without which nothing is going to happen. We have to see ourselves as neighbors, and the biblical authors understood that very well. That's why they would take, in the book of Genesis, disparate groups all over the map. And they called these groups, these territories and so forth, different names, like Reuben, Gad, Ephraim. You may not know these names, but these are the 12 sons of Israel. But those names were not sons originally. They were just the names of like Texas, Alabama, Georgia. And what the biblical authors did was say, these are actually the names of people, of individuals. And they actually are the names of all of one family. And they all go back to one ancestor, so that we were all in this together. We are kin. Did the earliest biblical readers think of that as historically that's the way it was? We all went back to Abraham? I don't think so. I think they probably appreciated the fact that, no, this is good literature. It's like a good movie. There's something more than just the factual kinds of information that is embedded in this text. It's an aspiration. It's about to think of ourselves as belonging to each other. So how would that look today? How do we come together in terms of creating an understanding of being a family? Without that, we're not going to be able to find any way of working across the aisle. But the biblical text teaches us that there is a possibility for doing that, right? So that's the one thing about the kinship and the love for neighbor. Now, the love for neighbor is often understood, especially in the sense of Jesus' parable, as loving everyone in the world. Love your neighbor. My neighbor could be someone in China. That's not the original meaning of it, nor is it even the meaning in the New Testament. Right? Do you remember the story in the New Testament where someone comes up to Jesus and asks him, just like with the Rabbi Hillel, what is the greatest commandment? Greatest commandment, thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, soul, and mind. Okay, what's the second greatest commandment? Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. And then the rabbi asks, okay, who is my neighbor? This is a great rabbinic conversation. Who's my neighbor? And what does Jesus do in a good rabbinic fashion? Says, let me tell you a parable. What's the parable? The parable of the Good Samaritan. Does everybody know that story? The Good Samaritan? Yeah? What is it about? It's a guy who's from Judah who goes on his way to Jericho, which is on the border, and he's going there and he gets robbed. And then there is a priest from Jerusalem who comes by and says, no, I don't want anything to do with him. And a Levite who comes by and says, I don't want to do it. These are like high-class people from Jerusalem. But then a Samaritan comes by and picks him up and takes him to an inn and gets him everything he needs to be able to continue on his way. Now, who is a Samaritan? A Samaritan is a member of the North. There was a division that's very central to the Bible between North and South, the Northern Kingdom and the Southern Kingdom. Just like in the U.S., it strikes me the parallels between like North and South Korea or East and West Germany or North and South in the U.S. These are deep divisions that often define national destinies. And that's very much the case for the Bible. So from a Southern Judean Jewish perspective, the Northerners, the Samaritans, were not equal with us. The point here, the Good Samaritan story is not about, look at the Greek or look at the Roman, the ones who are controlling us, this empire. They're not our neighbors. That's not what Jesus is teaching there. The neighbor is that member of the nation with whom we don't agree. Whether you're a Democrat or Republican, that's the Samaritan kind of connection there. And love for neighbor is loving another member of the nation. It's not Americans loving Germans, it's Americans loving Americans. That would be the proper application of neighbor. A neighbor is a member of your national community. And they understood that that love for neighbors in the national sense is at the heart of a world that flourishes. A world that flourishes, according to the biblical authors, is that each nation has the care and the solicitude to take care of their members and to make them flourish so that other nations will also benefit from them, each coexisting side by side, right? The prophetic vision is not that there's going to be one Israel who will encompass the whole nation and David, or a new David in Jerusalem, which will be the center of everything. No. The beautiful vision is every nation, every country existing side by side in peace. But nevertheless, every country having a sense of kinship, of neighborly love, and doing and fulfilling the obligations that we have, first of all, to those directly around us. The cosmopolitan vision of what it means to be a human. Does anybody know what the cosmopolitan kind of view is? It comes back from Socrates, or not Socrates, but the Stoics, who thought of, I am a citizen of the world. I am not a citizen of my country. I'm a citizen of the globe. It was the time of the Roman Empire. And so the cosmopolitan vision is that, I have a lot of students at Emory like this, who, or at least they used to be that way a lot more than more recently. And that is, they have trouble understanding why they have greater obligations to those in their own country more than those across the world. Their view is that we're all humans and that we all have to take care of each other and there should be no partiality. So that's what the cosmopolitanism. I'm not a member of any country, I'm just a human. In a response to this kind of cosmopolitan kinds of views, Martha Nussbaum, who is a philosopher at the University of Chicago and writes on the Greeks and so forth and brings them to bear on philosophical questions. She actually was born a Christian and then converted to Judaism and really drank deeply from the waters of Jewish thought. But in her early stages, she was questioning whether it's right to be a patriot. Right? Is patriotism something that is good? And so she had 20 thinkers come together and think about this question. And she really got schooled, if you will, in a wonderful way. Because these thinkers, whether it was Thomas Appiah, a professor from Ghana who teaches at Princeton and Columbia and other places, or Martha Himmelfarb and so forth, they all come together on this point. Here's how identity works. We don't begin with, I'm a citizen of the world. We begin as a child who's like, that's my mom, and I need my mom right now. That's the first connection. Later one says, oh, who's this guy right here? That's my dad, he might be okay. And starts to build bonds with the father. Oh, these are, that's your siblings. I don't like them. They're getting too close to me. They're taking the attention away from my mom. Okay, I'll love my siblings. Oh, are these people? Those are my cousins. And one grows out. And as one evolves and matures, one has a greater sense of the connections. But the first connections are to our own. And that's where our obligations begin. That's how Martha Himmelfarb or Martha Nussbaum would now answer that question. Our identity has to be taken from where we begin in life. We don't begin in life as just citizens of the world. We have obligations to those guys across the street who we don't agree with, but nevertheless help pay for the streets that we all drive on. That's my neighbor. That's whom I should have love for. This is my country. That love for country, it comes directly out of a source, and it's the Hebrew Bible. It's not Greece. It's not Rome. It's the Bible, the Hebrew Bible. Greece has an understanding of democracy. but they don't have an understanding of nationhood, of peoplehood. Their understanding of democracy was also a certain amount of the men who belonged to this class, they had the right to vote. But they never thought of, we're all one Greek people. That was very rarely the case. And it is with the Romans. It was the biblical sources that really fed into our understandings today of what it means to be a people. So let's step back for a second. Where does this text come from? So 587 is the date that you really need to remember. 587 BCE, before Christ, before the Common Era. That's when the Babylonians, the great empire that now ruled the world, they came and they wiped Jerusalem out. And everyone went into exile, or the kingdom was dissolved, and they might have gone to various regions. Some of them went to Babylon, but for all intents and purposes, there was nothing left. Slowly, groups came back, and they started to rebuild. This is the story of Ezra and Nehemiah, the rebuilding of the walls and so forth. But it was under very different conditions. They didn't have a King David in their midst. They were a province in an empire. And they knew that they would not have a King David anytime soon, because the Goliath now was not just a guy they could take out among the Philistines and with a slingshot. It was an empire. And they had to come to terms with a world in which they could no longer take down Goliath. So 587 is where that really comes to the fore for them. So throughout time, going long before 587, there were sources and texts and so forth that we understand to be part of the Bible. But without that moment of defeat, there would be no Bible. If you read through the stories of King David in the book of Samuel and so forth, he doesn't sit around and read the Torah. There's no study of text. In a world in which we have power and can take things for granted, we don't have to think about the future or about our identity as much. If, I would put it this way, if the U.S. were to really crumble around its borders and not know what the future is, then we would start asking, well, what does it really mean to be an American? An analogy is Israelis versus Jews who do not live in Israel. You might know this a little bit. Jews who live in Israel are not that often, at least, not that attuned to their Judaism. They're Israelis. They're not really into all the stuff that Jews have long done. Why? Because they can take their identity for granted. They have those borders. They have the kinds of educational system and so forth that tells them who they are. Once Israelis leave Israel, go to California, begin business, you know what they start doing? They start lighting Shabbat candles. They start doing rituals. Why? Because when you're not in a place where you can take for granted your identity for granted, you have to do something for your identity. So the defeat moment is like that. Everything that you had is no longer there. You can't take it for granted. Now you got to do something for it. So defeat is central to understanding why we have a Bible. And it's counterintuitive, right? We would think that the Bible came from the mountaintop on high when everything was going really well. Well, we do have text from that. But the story goes on, and there's so many other texts that have been added to it that really reflect deeply upon loss, about collective trauma. It's there to be an instruction manual for those moments when we can't take for granted the kinds of state of Israel or the state of the U.S. being strong. When all that crumbles, then we have to ask, well, what's going to hold us together? And the question for us as Americans is, what will hold us together? For the biblical authors, they answered in various ways. The kinship is part of it. The laws are part of it. The education, teaching your sons and daughters. Education, you can't be a people without knowing your past. If you got a great kingdom, you don't need to know your past. All you do is pay your taxes and go fight for the king. But now that we don't have a kingdom, we have to teach our children who we are. So that becomes a part of it. Religious rituals and on and on and on, festivals and calendar and all of that. That's how the biblical authors answered it. And they did it in other ways where you argue with God and through singing songs, and we can go on and on. It's a really impressive effort, collaborative effort to ask, what can we do in terms of things that will help us survive in a world in which we can't take our independence, our sovereignty for granted. But it would be helpful if we could ask those questions before we lose our sovereignty, before we lose our borders, before we lose everything we take for granted. Because if they could go back, they would say it would have been really nice if we had had this all implanted long before 587. Here's the point. Every kingdom, every state, every empire, whatever you are, there will be a time when you fall. History teaches that. No kingdom has lasted forever. So what are we going to think about in terms of what holds us together as a people? Unfortunately, in the academy today, we really don't want to ask that question. We want to be cosmopolitans. We want to say, oh, I'm really not that fond of being American in the first place. I really don't want to talk about American identity. It's so fraught with all kinds of chauvinistic ideas and so forth. I just want to think about what it means to be a human, or a human according to this group, which is transnational, whether it be this or that and that, right? There's all kinds of solidarities that social media allows you to have, but you're no longer attuned to being a neighbor and loving your neighbor and being obligated to help that one right there in front of you in your own town, across the street, and so forth. What would it take for us to think about what it means to be an American in a college campus? How do we even open that question for students? How can students start to see that the question is a powerful one? It goes back to the kinds of questions that Jesus, with the parable of the Good Samaritan, that all my students love. But once I start showing them that it's not about loving everyone, you're not supposed to love the Greeks and the Romans who wiped you out. There's a time for not loving, and there's a time for loving, but you love your fellow citizen. That gets more difficult for them. They have a hard time having allegiances to people in their own country. I spent a lot of time in Germany, and that's the same thing. After World War II, Germans had a terrible time, and still do in many cases, with being proud to be a German. They understand that the whole project of German peoplehood led to fascism, and therefore peoplehood is wrong, and one should just be a cosmopolitan, a citizen of this world, a European, or what have you, but not take any pride in your own national identity anymore. And that's where we are in American campuses as well. So we'll talk maybe later about how you're doing it, Dr. Edwards and others. That's a big problem I have. I do it by teaching the Bible. And fortunately, most of my students are going to become future pastors and all of that. Become pastors, and the future pastors are already serving. So I get to work with the biblical text to show them how the biblical authors are already asking these questions and have really powerful insights for us today as we're facing questions of division and so forth. But where the Bible is no longer at the center of classrooms, right? How are you going to do that? The question has to be asked, and students have to start thinking about that. And it would be helpful for them to think about it before that 587 moment. I'm going to look at my time real quickly. 6:50. Wow, that went fast. The final part of this is, yes, we have a Bible that's going to help us think about what it means to be a neighbor to each other, what it means to have laws at our center and stories that tell our history and help us think about being a larger family. But what is a Bible for our time? Yes, it would be nice if we could get the Bible back in classrooms. But if the biblical scribes were to come back to us today, they would say, we did this for our own time. We didn't know that it would shape 2 millennia of history. But what are you guys doing right now in your time? Reading our work is wonderful. We think it's the best. And we think Jacob Wright wrote the best book about what it's all about. But what are you doing in your time to make a Bible? What would that Bible look like? Stanley Fish was here and with Judith Butler, and he pushes back against the kind of concept of canon. Maybe not Fish so much, but a lot within the academy have troubles with canon. What is canon? C-A-N-O-N. It actually means just a fixed rule, but it's an attempt to say this body of literature, these are the texts that define us. It doesn't have to be exclusive, but it needs to point to something. So the biblical canon has a number of books, and that belongs to the Old Testament canon or the New Testament canon. There's the canon of European literature that used to be, but it's been abandoned because it's white, old men, and chauvinistic. But what's lost with all that is a body of works, of literature that can, like the Hebrew Bible, that can help us think about what it means to be a people. If we can't use the Hebrew Bible itself anymore in the classroom to the same extent, and perhaps we can reinvigorate that, but it's never going to solve the fundamental problem that we don't have a canon. We don't have a body of literature that all students are required to learn, that we can point to. Everyone knows this piece of music. Everyone knows this poem. Everyone can debate with each other with reference to one thing. Without a reference to some body of a canon of literature, we just talk past each other. And the wonderful thing about the biblical canon, and our canons must replicate that, they're not creeds. They don't say A, B, C, D, or 1, 2, 3, 10 things that you have to repeat and memorize and profess. But rather, it's a body of literature that with stories, and you have to enter the fray of the stories and figure out, who's the good guy here? Well, there is really no good guy. Well, what would you do in these positions? What is the right law? Here's one law, but there's another law that contradicts that. You are drawn into a conversation, and that conversation is what creates community. But we don't have a text to draw us in the conversation. Everyone is going into their own text. That's my biggest question for me as an intellectual. How do we create a canon in a time in which canons are seen as prejudicial or chauvinistic or elitist and so forth? Well, whatever it is, create some body of text that we all can agree on, and that we, as we get older and as we move in different directions, we can at least point to these texts and say, I disagree with that, or I like this part of the canon. And you go back and forth, just like Jews do today, with a community that is centered on Torah study and argument, and nevertheless, that is very cohesive. Jews are cohesive because we argue together. But what gives us that cohesiveness is a body of work, a body of literature with verses that we can point to and say, you're wrong. Verse 2:7 says something different. And knowing the text and being able to be conversant in it is available to anyone. It doesn't require any kind of special prerogative. You can be male or female or a child. At the Shabbat table, children are encouraged to argue with their fathers. Everyone. That's where community is built, by having a text, coming together with questions around that text, seeing the diversity of viewpoints embedded in it, but nevertheless arguing with each other and walking away and wanting to come back to argue again. But we don't have that. All the text that we bring into the classroom right now is like, Moby Dick, can't read that anymore. This book, we can't read that anymore. And it's elimination after elimination after elimination. And so I leave you with a very kind of negative result is, what will it look like? How do we build a canon, a body of literature that's going to be open enough to get buy-in from both sides of the aisle, but nevertheless is going to be a body of literature that really inspires students and adults to argue with each other, because that's what we need. I'll stop here.
right, so we have maybe 15 minutes or so, 20 minutes for questions. We don't need to take all that time, but if we have that much time, please keep your questions to, maybe 30 seconds. If you're going about more than 30 seconds, it might be a monologue and not a question. And try and keep it sort of on the topic, but we've got a lot of room here. I think. Anybody got any questions they'd like to pose?
I want to go back to that last question that you had about needing a canon and what is the American canon. Perhaps in Socratic fashion, you're wanting us to reflect on that, but you personally, if you could come up with a few books that you think would be a part of the American canon that sort of defines the American ethos, what would you say they are?
Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus. No. Definitely the Hebrew Bible, because all the students I teach, whether in the college at Emory, they have no connection to it, they love the stories. These texts, I wish I had more time. We'll do it more at the synagogue, talk about how these scribes created literature in our sense of the term. There were no readers back then. They were writing for themselves, and they had the idea to create text. And they were the first to innovate in the sense of writing literature that kids would want to read or parents would want to read. So the Bible definitely, I don't know, and that's where I leave the other stuff. Moby Dick is a favorite one of mine. Would one need, I'll ask you, would one need kind of like a group of intellectuals to come and argue this out? It would be not just books. It might be movies, it might be music, it might include jazz and symphonies and pop music and so forth. And different kinds of, there's a body of knowledge, but we don't have it. It's just such a minimal view of what students need, rather than a maximal view in the sense of these are the things that are going to join us all together. In Israel, in Germany, even with Germany being very post-patriotic, post-nationalist, they still have a body of work that they learn. You know about Goethe, you know about Herder, you know about this poem and that poem. And American students don't have that at all. And France has it, Israel, a lot of it. Yeah, Mark. Not Mark.
Thank you. You talk about the issue and problems of peoplehood in an American context, but I think, and you may agree, that America among the nations of the world is quite unique in that we are comprised of people from everywhere. And we are not, when you look at the totality of the demography of this country, we're not the same people that we were 50 years ago or 100 years ago. On the other hand, I spend a fair amount of time in China, and they have no problem there of we are Chinese and we've been Chinese for 1,000 generations, and here's what it means to us to be Chinese. So would you agree that the issue that you're describing is really unique to the American context?
Good question. It is. A lot of my mentors who I asked this very same question to say America is just a unique beast and it's just too big and too diverse to have that. I will say this, that Israel, ancient Israel, consisted of very fractious groups. They, the joke of there's a Jewish guy on an island and he builds 2 synagogues, one he goes to and one he doesn't go to, so Jews like to argue and there's lots of division. So if the biblical authors could overcome division between these groups, even in a small piece of land, there is the ability to affirm some kind of belonging in a way that China doesn't need to. The U.S. needs a Bible, maybe not the Bible, but needs a Bible in the sense of like a book of Genesis and a common laws and so forth. That's why we have those kinds of, we are the new Israel. And the laws of Moses are the Constitution, and modeling ourselves after that because we don't have this long history and this kind of homogenous cultural heritage. So the Bible is, I think, a great model for
a nation like America, and I think it's possible. My biggest concern is the will to do it, and the kind of falling back on, well, it's best just to leave me alone and let me do my own thing, and as long as I'm happy for my own family, you and your own family, just stay away from us. The problem with that is it's not working very well. We need a more robust sense of what does it mean to be an American, because without love for neighbor, nothing works. If it's everyone just chasing after their own agenda, things start to fall apart very easily. What do you think?
Well, I think that's where we are. We have groups facing their own agenda. We have political divisions. We have political divisions in this country that encourage that. That encourage, it's us against them, it's white against black, men against women, young against old, us against foreigners. Pick whatever division you want to pick, and we have political groups in this country that encourage these divisions for their own political purposes, and I don't think that it was always like this. I said earlier in my remark that we were a different country 50 years ago. In fact, at the founding of this country, the founders were all Christians. And you talk about, yes, the 5 great books of Moses, and they all read the 5 books of Moses. And they read the history of they read the Enlightenment. They were creatures of the Enlightenment, and they were reading the books of the Enlightenment. And they had this great commonality. But that's changed over the years. We have a lot of people in this country don't even speak English, for example. You can't have a peoplehood without a common language. Now, you talk about a canon. It's really what you really mean, I think, is a canon of ideas. A country, after all, is an abstract idea that we all simultaneously hold in our minds. So we believe in this idea of this country, but I don't think that's the case in America necessarily anymore.
That's how we define a nation. A nation is a state of mind. It's not a state of, in the traditional sense, but it's the ability to want to live together and want to work together. And there has to be some common, it's not necessarily language, but something even more than language. So back in ancient Israel, there were various dialects, but they would write the canon within one language because they wanted people to be able to converse with each other over one text. Does that mean that they would have to get rid of the languages in their private lives? No, they would speak dialects. Hebrew was being read while they were speaking Aramaic, but nevertheless, you would study a language as a common body. Another thing that you said is it's ideas, yes, but ideas can be too like up in the air in the cloud. We need something where you can point to them and memorize a poem and say you got the poem wrong because this is how it goes. And they say, well, I interpreted that differently. And then we start conversing with each other. It's about arguing with each other. And if it's all about these are our ideas, we all agree with them, yeah, I don't see the basis for really kind of having that kind of typical back and forth over a body of text as we do within a Jewish community. My larger question, I guess, is the model for Jewish community applicable for a larger political body? And I don't know if that's right, but I sense that there's something there to it, especially since America is founded on that model of having 13 states, of like the 12 tribes. What is our point of unity? Laws at our center, kinship, songs, and so forth. There was a question over there, I think.
I like where you're going with that, right? As a Jew, I taught my kids, we read the Bible to see the limitations of these people, right? Moses, our great teacher, and all his limitations. I taught anthropology here for a quarter of a century, and I always made sure to invoke the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Gettysburg Address. But I insisted we treat the people who wrote those as people, right, in a very Jewish sense. But that was kind of being woke, because I was showing the limitations. I talked about these slave owners. It wasn't to base them, but to actually go deep into the text, to actually understand the Declaration of Independence with its ideals and the limitation of its people. So I think there is that potential. I just think there's not enough confidence in this country to actually say, these are real people doing this. They had strengths and limitations. Something in Judaism we can do with ease.
Thank you for that. And what Mr. Markovitz was saying right before that is there are forces in our culture, both political and I would add economic forces like social media. Social media thrives on us arguing with each other and not having a common basis. And the more division we have, the algorithms work better, as well as just the market metrics. It's better if you're in the business of selling refrigerators to have a lot of divorces because you need 2 refrigerators after that. So we have to understand that it's not just all,
Furniture the same, not just refrigerators.
Everything, toasters and all of that. So, so there are market metrics and social media and so forth. You can't let total free enterprise run the system. It has to be a sense of we are in this together. The ship could go down unless we all have all hands on deck. And on that note, also, the biblical text is often maligned for being misogynistic and not according women important roles, but it's not true at all. Women are so central to the text. Why? They need all hands on deck. In a world in which you want to have a sense of kinship, well, who's going to teach that sense of kinship? It's the mothers. They're the ones who are also going to show you how to survive in a world where you can't be the kind of David versus Goliath. And all of these kinds of things that women model in the text are very important also for the kinds of, probably the kinds of cultural forces that we need in our own society, and that is, how do we come together? Yes, we have to sometimes be the mother bear who fights off and is protective, but at the same time, it can't be about the egos, the guys who are always trying to make it about their names and so forth. And that's where the biblical authors are very good at kind of demoting those heroes and making them into anti-heroes and showing that the women like Deborah, who is a great leader, but she's not all about her own name. And she's about the people as a mother of the nation and so forth. So inculcating that will be a large part of getting away from the kind of individualistic macho attitude. Sorry, kind of.
I've really enjoyed the talk. A lot of what you're talking about, you're talking about concepts of nation building and identity building, and what does it mean in a fractured landscape to put this larger collective concept back together. But I think the whole European world has a deep trauma from the war. I think for most countries kind of downstream of the European context, it's that we're talking about ideology. We're talking about well, look at what it led to. Look at how these extremes of, ideology and nationhood. Now, you might define that a little bit differently, but I think the thing we need to get over is I think people disagree with the concept itself. I think they fear it. And I agree with you entirely that it's a necessity and we have to navigate this, but I think it's something that so many people, they fear the very attempt to do it, So I'm curious your thoughts.
So the idea is that, look at this really robust sense of being one people as modeled in Germany or in Italy, and look how quickly it turned fascist. Therefore, all nationalism is inherently going to be fascist and discriminatory and so forth. And in a certain sense, that is throwing the baby out with the bathwater. There is a way to be a patriot without hating others. It's about, being a patriot is about whom do I love? Being a chauvinist is who do I hate, right? And the focus is on love. And it can creep in. The biblical authors are very much aware of this xenophobia that can creep in, and that's why they're facing it almost on every page, right? The book of Joshua, go in and conquer the land. Who's the first one they meet? Rahab. She's a Canaanite. What do? They save her. Or Ruth the Moabite, and on and on. This question of xenophobia is like, if we're going to have a strong sense of a peoplehood, then what about those who don't belong? How do we integrate them? Why don't, all of those kinds of things have to be paid attention to very carefully, because a project of being one can be dangerous without an understanding of how you integrate the others. But the project of being one is too important to just throw it out as, oh, it's always going to bring dangers, because the dangers of not being one are equally great.
Thank you. You know, I think that one of the issues that we have is that, yes, people are rejecting nationalism because of the fascist experience. But in fact, I tend to believe that all ideologies have a degenerate form. And given long enough, everything will degenerate. And so what we've got is fascism is really a degenerate form of nationalism. And we've run all the way to the other extreme, which is a place that we're already occupying, which is the degenerate form of individual rights, which strangely becomes globalism. Because as an individual, as an extreme individual, we've also moved away from the concept of obligation, which is usually to those closest to me, and correspondingly, we've moved away from the concept of gratitude. And we've replaced them in our society with an overarching sense of entitlement.
I wish you had given the talk tonight. That's exactly what I'm trying to say. That is, that cosmopolitanism moves to the individual. It starts with the individual, and it then is built on entitlement, and it's the very antithesis of working together. Where do you think it comes from, though, the individualism?
Well, I mean, I think that the entire, you know, the entire Enlightenment and liberalism basically said, you know, historically, we all belong to a collective, right? I mean, we talk a lot about slavery, but the truth is slaves were not the only people born into a station in life. Most people were born into a station in life. And if you didn't like it, you could become a monk or a priest, or you could become a pirate. But beyond that, you know, if my father was a cooper, I'm a cooper. And if my father was a blacksmith, I'm a blacksmith. And if my father is a slave, I'm a slave. And if my father is a noble, I'm a noble. I mean, that's just the way it went. And so we started moving away from that and saying, what if we let people become the masters of their own destiny? And now we keep that on autopilot, and we get to the point at which I don't know anything to anybody.
Yeah, but okay, I get that the Enlightenment is the culprit for a lot of the individualism that we face today. However, those who are radically into their own kind of self-selecting communities and following their own political agendas at the loss of kind of this sense of unity, they're also very post-Enlightenment. They don't, they see the Enlightenment as a great sin and a kind of a Western chauvinistic idea. So that explanation I've heard before, but I think there's something more, and I think it's just kind of the, I almost feel like it's an outside agitator who's like driving this to keep us all separate over the most ridiculous issues. I mean, the most divisive issues are the ones that we talk the most about, and it seems to me that has to come from like somewhere from, like, where is that coming from? It's not Enlightenment thought, it's some kind of, whether it's a market or political or something. Yeah.
It may be, but I think you have to remember that the self-selected communities tend to be ephemeral. Right? I've been parts of communities. I had a friend who ran an art gallery. We had a great community. Then the economy went south, the art gallery went out of business. Right? I mean, the self-selected communities, maybe they last 20 years. They don't perpetuate because nobody feels obliged to perpetuate them. They usually center around a charismatic individual.
So, but the question is, why is it increasing so much right now? Why is the radical individualism, self-selected communities, the various kinds of things that we see among students where there is a real reluctance to kind of
embrace traditional, long-standing communities and a willingness to to form their own. What do you think is driving that?
Let me just move on just to another question so some other people
Sorry,
have a
I don't
chance.
mean
No,
that.
it's very good, but
Wouldn't the danger in both nationalism and tribalism, individuality, be a sense of exceptionalism? Isn't that kind of where nationalism goes wonky?
So what do you mean by exceptionalism, though?
The sense that your nation or your personhood or your tribe is above others.
Yeah, I've always had trouble with the exceptionalism concept because I think that every people, everyone, every family should think, I got the best family. I got the best country. I got the best town. I got the best football club. I got this, the best. It doesn't have to mean that you are awful and you deserve to die and we're going to wipe you out. But the kind of, and I know that's being trite with the exceptionalism, but there has to be that pride. And what we want is to instill, we want to model pride in our own. Like, as a Jew teaching in a Christian cemetery, it's like, what's this chosenness? Aren't you supposed to be embarrassed because you see that yourself as the chosen people? And I want to say, no, you should see yourself as part of the chosen people too. Everyone. Will be determined in the last day who actually is the chosen people. Perhaps we're all, but in the meantime, we need to see ourselves as a chosen people, our communities as special, and this is the best. African American students who are saying, I am very proud to be an African American student, as Jewish students are very proud to be Jewish students and believe that they get the best of all worlds. But I'm missing some point that you wanted to bring up.
Well, I think there's a difference between having pride. I can be proud of a job that I've done well without saying that makes me better than this person who's done their job well and who's proud of their accomplishments.
So I'm not that familiar with the whole discourse here, but where does the exceptionalism play itself out directly? Like, how does that work? Where does it go from just feeling like this is the best of all countries to we're better than you? Maybe say it more. Just
I guess there's a point where that's where it becomes almost toxic, is when it becomes you're lower than me.
Yeah.
Because of, for Germany, your blood.
Yeah, I think it's like, it doesn't have to be that way. It means like, I just got married, Valentine's Day, and I believe my wife is the best wife in the world. That doesn't mean that I go to Stewart's and says, your wife is so inferior. It's like, that's a different mode.
Right.
And he says he has the best wife, and we all, help me think about when does it turn from just being really confident, this is my best, without meaning that you have an awful wife.
Your wife is
Why
the
is it
best.
a zero-sum game?
Your wife is the best, and your wife is the best for you. That doesn't mean
Okay.
your wife would be the best for him.
That's right.
He didn't say that his wife is better than other.
Right, and that's where it becomes,
His wife is the best.
right, and so that's,
Have to make the other people lower.
right, and that's the thing. Like, once there's a hierarchical, well, my wife is the best, so your wife is.
let's
yeah.
keep the people with the mics doing the talking.
Okay.
Well, and that's the point. Like, your wife can be the best, and she is the best for you. But your wife would not be the best for someone else.
That's right. And it doesn't have to be like,
So it doesn't have to be taking someone down.
that's right. And that's where we're on the same page. It doesn't have to be taking someone down. But when the exceptionalism is used as an excuse not to have pride in your own community or your own nation or something, as if it's, as soon as you're proud, then you're being an exceptionalist.
I think they're separate concepts.
Yeah, I agree with you. I agree with you. They're separate. Exceptionalism is a feeling of wanting to oppress others because they're not, or I don't know.
Well, let's go to, I know Rancor had one.
Thank you, David. Professor, maybe to depersonalize this a little bit, I think we've leapt from individualism to egoism. And by that I mean what we celebrate in this country today is being famous for being famous. We don't join leagues anymore. Our youth spend 8 hours a day on telephones trying to get more likes, make more friends. So they have this online persona that's incredibly self-gratifying, but they don't talk to one another. We don't join bowling leagues anymore. Participation in everything that brought communities together in this country is down, and people are spending hours in front of their TVs and their computer screens doing things that are wholly, perhaps in many cases, unhealthy, but also very, very different from what we've done for thousands of years. So maybe that's a piece of it. I don't know. Thoughts on that?
Oh, definitely. That's why I'm saying that the whole divide and conquer was probably not created for the Roman Empire as much as for social media today. You divide everybody up, and you can that's why China does not allow their youth to spend too many hours on screen, right? They ban TikTok for their own, and they say there's another form of TikTok, but the kids only get to spend 1 hour a day on it. What do they understand? That is self-destructive to our sense of being a community. You cannot have everyone on their little device, their screen, and then hope to have a strong country. How do you do that in America? Are you going to allow a government to tell us what we want to do with our children? It would be much better if we could learn that ourselves. And I think people are like Jonathan Haidt, with his book about screen time and so forth, are trying to awaken how destructive this is. But it's definitely a part of social media, and that's also part of the market metrics. The algorithms are there to feed you like a rat in the cage, a little bit more sugar each time to hit that thing, and it's totally addictive and destructive.
I mean, this is a topic that I think a lot about, and I think it's what is the relationship of culture to technology? And I think at a certain point, you have to say that one is subordinate to the other. Is technology subordinate to culture, or is culture subordinate to technology? In America, we've leaned the way of the market, which is saying if there is a technology that people demand that is profitable or expands the scope of human power, then we're just going to let people, use that however you want. In China, they do the opposite. They say technology is in some ways subordinate to culture. Real quick, an example that I thought was interesting is in Europe, that was once the time when they invented the mechanical crossbow. This weapon was seen as almost anti-Christian. It wasn't Christian to use it, and so it was banned. They didn't use a powerful technology because it went, except against people in the Middle East. But they didn't use a powerful technology because it was in some way antithetical to their culture. And I think we've lost that muscle, and we've lost the ability to decide, how do we choose what is good for us, or are we just on an automated course of the growth of technology?
Yeah, thank you for that.
I'd see one more question back there from someone who's not spoken yet.
In discussion, you're talking about having a canon for a nation, but you live in a society that's essentially individualized and alienated from itself.
Yeah.
People in this country have very little to do with each other on every level except when they have to. You walk down the street in Manhattan, and there are hundreds of thousands of people, and you realize you know nobody. And that's really the model right now of this country. So what you're proposing is something that's akin to maybe a nation state where basically it was small enough and the community was inherently close enough in its values that it could form this kind of canon. But now, when you live in a polyglot society like we have now, that's alienated and has been driven that way through media and through all kinds of other forces, through destruction of relationships and marriages, and through alienating experiences that people have had individually that's led them into therapy so that they feel their injury is different than you. You can't have this kind of canon, because this nation doesn't exist in the same way as you're proposing it. Now, what you'd have to do is decrease the alienation and make the individual less pernicious and more related to other individuals to get to your state. That's what I'd like to say.
Well, what's the hope then? What's your hope?
My personal hope?
It's all out?
My personal hope is that everybody put down their devices, start to talk to each other again, find what drew the ancient Jews together. And it wasn't only the fact that they were persecuted across time and region, but they had emotional connection to each other. They had similar feelings and beliefs about things. So if you have to talk about a canon, you have to start finding people who aren't alienated enough so they can really share themselves with each other and maybe form this kind of connection.
Okay, that's where you have to read my book, if I may plug it. It's Why the Bible Began. I try to show it that at the beginning, it wasn't a library from some small people who already were united. It wasn't a cross-section of the literature they already knew. This was the work of scribes who were trying to bring people together. Of course, a much smaller population than what we have today. Nevertheless, it was all aspirational. They were trying to say, with this text, one day people will come together and read it. Did anybody read at the time? 1% of the population read at the time. Did they like what they were reading about Moses? Probably not. It took centuries for people to grab onto that. So these scribes who were living in very dark days, who had this vision, that's what we need to be like, the scribes. What is our vision? What is going to bring people together? What kinds of stories? What kinds of laws? What kinds of songs and poetry and on are going to bring? And that's where we need our artists and our intellectuals, and we got to dig deep, and we got to have that great vision. And that's where the hope grows out of it. It's not about, well, maybe they'll just lay down their devices. They have to find something better than the devices. And I don't know how to do it. I wish I had the answer, like, what would a canon look like today? What's the physical form? No one wants to even touch books anymore, so how would it look? And I leave it to you all to kind of figure that out for yourselves. But the situation was not that they had a homogenous society. I'm repeating myself. There wasn't a homogenous society for these biblical authors. They didn't have similar beliefs. These are things that evolved with the work that they did. They started having similar beliefs after they started reading texts that taught them about similar things. And you get it.
I think that's a good point for us to draw this to an end. Thank you, Dr. Wright. Hope you all will join us for more of these Socratic Stage events this semester. There's one on Saturday you heard about. Have a good evening. Thank you.